Okay, good. Well, welcome to this class in the continuing series where we're looking at chapters 4 and 5 of Master Shantideva. Let's go ahead and begin with some prayers, the prayers that we've been doing before the sessions. We begin with the homage to Shakyamuni Buddha, which again, from the side of the Buddha doesn't need our homage, our praise, but we want to align ourselves with the Buddha as much as possible, recognizing all of these qualities that the Buddha possesses that we're reciting, and also recalling that we ourselves can attain those same states of having completely destroyed and gotten rid of all of our obscurations, just like the Buddha did. So we're trying to create that synergy with the Buddha so that we can receive the inspiration and blessings to be able to accomplish that state in the same way that he did. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Then let's do the Mandala Offering. So again, this is where we visualize the entire phenomenal world transformed into a beautiful Buddha paradise that's representative of our own future enlightenment as well as the enlightenment of all beings. We're making this vast, pure offering so that we can receive the blessings of the Buddha, the inspiration of the Buddha, and again, become just like him. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then the final prayer, refuge in bodhicitta before the teaching. Again, these two ideas that are encapsulated in this verse, the first two pertaining to refuge, the strong sense of safe direction that we find ourselves in the Buddha, and especially the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, as well as the Sangha, the Supreme Assembly, those who have practiced the teachings further than we have developed great realizations. So we're finding a sense of safe direction in those three, recognizing that they are our source of protection in terms of all of the suffering that we are dealing with. And then the last two lines where we think about the mind of bodhicitta that we're going to meditate on as well. Again, this mind that is so central to Shantideva's text. The wish to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings, and thinking that we're here to listen to the Dharma with that motivation. We'll do this once in English and twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chunyen gi pe sonam gi, dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi pe senam gi dola penchir sangye dupar sho. Okay, let's go ahead and do a short meditation then. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit and to come into this space together with a good intention, a good motivation. I'll lead you in a short reflection on that after a few minutes of quiet meditation. So again, find what works for you in terms of a meditation posture, and then choose a way to work with the breath, one that works for your mind. If you need a suggestion, again, I generally suggest working with a sensation in the area of the nostrils, where we feel the air coming in and out as we inhale, as we exhale. But staying present with the breath, the goal is always to try to maintain your mindfulness of the breath as best as you can. Then we have this factor that we're studying as part of this chapter, introspection, sort of a spy in the corner of the mind that checks in occasionally to see the quality of our meditation. And if we check in and we see that we've lost our awareness of the breath, that we've forgotten to keep present with the breath, then at that time we adjust, we correct by letting go of whatever it was that was distracting us and bringing the mind back to the breath. So I will ring the bell to begin this meditation period, a few minutes in silence, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation of bodhicitta. So now let's set our motivation together and just take a moment to really appreciate this day that we have, this time that we have together. And one of the first subjects in the stages of the path, the Lamrim, is the whole idea of us having this very precious, perfect human rebirth. Right now, this is the form that our minds have taken, that we are together with this human body. And while there are certainly many forms of suffering in this human existence, the opportunity that this human life affords is unbelievable. Is said to be quite rare when we look at all the various states of existence that the Buddha taught. But regardless of your own faith in those various realms of existence, we can acknowledge certainly that this human life does have amazing opportunity, amazing richness. With this human mind, we can turn our awareness towards the Dharma. We can investigate these topics. We can change our minds. And this is so important to then take advantage of the opportunity that we have and to have the greatest motivation for engaging in teachings like we're doing tonight. So set in your own heart this strong intention to benefit others. This is the seed of bodhicitta, the compassionate wish to free all sentient beings from their suffering, the love that wants to place them all in happiness. And from those two emotions of compassion and love, we generate the wish to be able to benefit others through our attaining enlightenment, through our practicing the deeds of the Bodhisattva, as we're learning in this text, being able to practice generosity, morality, patience, joyous effort, concentration, wisdom, to do all of these tasks, the six perfections, with the mind of bodhicitta, with the mind that is determined to help all sentient beings by becoming enlightened ourselves. So whenever we turn our minds towards the Dharma, but especially when we get together on events like this and study the deeds of a bodhisattva, it's important that we align ourselves with the motivations of the bodhisattvas, with the desire to free all sentient beings from their suffering, to bring them to happiness, and the recognition that in order to accomplish this, we have to become a Buddha. We have to become fully enlightened. Otherwise, we simply lack the ability to do that perfectly. So embracing all beings without exception in this thought as the scope of this mind of bodhicitta, generate in your heart now that strong intention to help every one of them through developing your own qualities. And it's for this reason that we're engaging in these teachings. Okay, so we are working our way through chapter 5 now, having done chapter 4. And again, previous to this, I had done the first 3 chapters, taught those at Shantideva Center last October. So chapter 4 was all about conscientiousness, especially maintaining conscientiousness around bodhicitta, this intention that we just meditated on, as well as conscientiousness in avoiding being overtaken by the afflictions, having this desire to continue on our path of virtue and so on. In this chapter, chapter 5, we're looking mostly at the mental factor of introspection, this guarding alertness, heedfulness that keeps us in line, that keeps us aware of what's going on in our minds. And of course, the accompanying mental factor of mindfulness, the mindfulness that keeps us present, that keeps us aware of what we're doing. But then again, we need that introspection to act. Again, we talked a little bit in last week's class, it's not quite judgmental. It's a factor that helps us to know what's going on. as I said, an introspection doesn't necessarily even have any moral tone to it. It depends upon what intentions we have behind having that introspection. So if we want to maintain a path of virtue to avoid non-virtue, which is mostly what this chapter is about, by looking at morality, this is the second perfection of the six perfections. If we're going to have that strong intention to abide by what the Buddha taught in terms of creating the causes for our own happiness and the happiness of others through practicing virtue and benefiting beings, as well as to avoid the causes of suffering for ourselves and others by avoiding non-virtuous actions, well, then we need to have that awareness that is continually being generated. And the introspection acts as a guide to kind of keep us in line, so that if we see that we're wandering away from that, it pulls us back in line by seeing that we've gone astray. So again, this is the intention behind this, the study of this chapter, is to give us the tools to work with to master our minds and to be able to stay on the sort of straight and narrow path. So what we've looked at so far, again, just to go back to towards the beginning when we started this chapter, the whole text of the chapter consists of these 109 verses. I think I said 108 earlier, but 109. And we're getting into the verses that explain extensively how to practice. And whoops, went 2 slides. And within explaining extensively how to practice, we had the first outline that we completed last time, guarding the mind as a method for guarding the trainings. That was mostly looking at the whole idea that our minds are very central in all of this. Even though we can talk about actions that we do physically and verbally, the mind is behind all of that. The mind is the source of all of that. The mind is how we perfect the six perfections, as we saw. We don't perfect them on the outside, we perfect them on the inside. So this was that whole first section that we already concluded. We are currently towards the end of this second outline, which is guarding mindfulness and introspection, the method for guarding the mind. Again, so this is going to lead us then into the third outline. I think there are 4 outlines in total underneath this, explaining extensively how to practice. But this second one had 2 outlines. The first of which we, I believe, completed last week, just looking at the showing through the initial verse, verse 23, kind of showing how if we are to guard the mind, then we need these 2 factors of mindfulness and introspection. I'm going to didn't put verse 23 on a slide, but I can read one translation of it. I don't have all of them in front of me, but anyway, you who wish to protect your mind, guard with wholehearted effort, mindfulness and introspection. I request with hands folded. So this was Master Shantideva really just essentially saying, if we're going to guard our minds, if we're going to be attentive and protect our minds to keep it on the path that leads to happiness for ourselves and others, then we need these 2 factors. These have to be guarded as well. So we are in the second outline of that. That was the first one, was verse 23, where we looked at showing. The second outline was explaining. And the first outline we concluded last week, the faults of lacking introspection. Here, Master Shantideva was essentially saying that if we don't have introspection, we're going to have little power behind all of our work, all of our practice. We won't be able to achieve pure wisdom. We won't be able to achieve pure morality. We may even have some of our accumulated virtue that we had developed destroyed by virtue of lacking that introspection. And then again, the fact that it might even obstruct us from achieving virtue that we haven't yet achieved. Introspection is a very important part of our practice. It is, again, that spy in the corner of our minds that sort of keeps track, that is just checking in to make sure that our minds are in the right direction. And it's rooted in, as I said earlier, the values that we have come to want to adopt in our lives, the ways in which we want to practice. And so it's to keep us on track, to keep us aware of what we're doing. If we have mindfulness in place, then we don't necessarily need the introspection, because the mindfulness is what keeps us present with what we are doing at the moment and holding on to those values in the moment. Introspection is the checking up to see whether we are still doing that. If our mindfulness is there, we don't necessarily need introspection. But if our mindfulness has waned and we have moved away from what we are trying to do, then we need that factor to make us aware of that and thereby pull us back into the mode of behavior that we want to engage in. So the second outline within this, again, the first outline was the faults of lacking introspection. The second outline is guarding mindfulness as the method for guarding introspection. Again, these 2 are companions. And so if we guard our mindfulness, then we are definitely guarding our introspection, because with the mindfulness present with what we're doing, then we need not have too much worry about what we're doing. So this has two outlines. The very first one we did go into at the end of last week's class, but I'm going to review it again since these two come together, these two outlines under guarding mindfulness as the method for guarding introspection. It was showing through verse 29. So Master Shantideva says in this verse, "Therefore, I shall never let mindfulness depart from the doorway of my mind. If it goes, I should recall the harms of the lower realms and closely place it there." So again, this verse is saying that if we are, one of the thoughts we can have from studying this topic is that we never want our mindfulness to leave. We always want to be mindful of what it is that we are doing. That's the real answer to it. As I said just a few minutes ago, with mindfulness present, our introspection doesn't necessarily need to be there, because the introspection, that guarding alertness, is to keep us the mindfulness occurring and to correct it when we've lost that awareness of what we're doing, that mindfulness. So if we make that commitment to never let our mindfulness depart from the doorway of our mind, then we will abide in that place of mindful awareness, knowing what it is that we are doing at every moment, knowing exactly what we want to be staying in tune with, being aware of bodhicitta motivation through every moment, trying to never harm others, to always do good, and so on. All of that is what informs our mindfulness. I mentioned earlier, Lama Zopa Rinpoche doesn't have a problem with the word mindfulness. He just does. It needs to be more than just an awareness of what's going on. We have to have something that informs it. He uses the term bodhicitta mindfulness to talk about the ways in which we bring bodhicitta to mind with everything that we do. So this is the idea behind this verse of kind of telling us that if we guard our mindfulness, then introspection is definitely guarded. It's protected as well, because with mindfulness, we never let our minds go astray. If our mindfulness does go, as he says in the third line there, I should recall the harms of the lower realms, and then closely place mindfulness back in operation at that time. So the harms of the lower realms is certainly one thing that we bring to mind frequently, and we're even going to see coming up in one of the verses tonight that a fear of the lower realms, a fear of the repercussions through what are called the fruitional or ripening results of our karma, is what keeps us going in the path of practicing good morality. And that is the initial motivation that we often learn in the stages of the path, is that this awareness of the fact that our actions can propel us into an unfortunate existence. We can end up as an animal, as a hungry ghost, a preta, or as a hell being, one of these beings that is involved in very, very heavy suffering due to having very negative minds, negative actions that ensued from that. So all of this is initially taught in the Lam Rim as a way of waking us up to the consequences of our actions. We're in the driver's seat, and if we do engage in the 10 non-virtues and so on, the consequences of powerful actions that we do can be these subsequent rebirths in these unfortunate realms. So the initial feeling that we get is one of our own dread or apprehension with regard to our own future suffering, which is a motivating factor for a lot of things, right? We even make decisions in this life about what we do, what we don't do, on the basis of some holding our future moments in this life to be very precious and something we want to take care of. We avoid eating unhealthy foods, and we get exercise, and we do all those things because we want to have a good old age and so on. Well, we make decisions all the time on the basis of future suffering and wanting to avoid it. So this is one of the thoughts that we introduce again right at the beginning of the Lam Rim, is to not just think in terms of this life and avoiding future suffering, but what about future suffering in the next life? So again, we can still have a path that adheres to practicing virtue and avoiding non-virtue with other motivations. We can do that out of our desire not to harm others as well, because the non-virtuous actions we often engage in are those that harm other beings. It's not to say that there can't be other motivations of compassion, care, concern for others, but the initial motivation is to see our own future suffering, and of course to recognize that we don't want to experience that, but we also don't want to be in a state where we can't use that life meaningfully, where we can't actually benefit others in that existence and continue on our path. So there's always kind of a lot of different dimensions we can see, but the initial thought here is kind of, if we bring to mind, that future suffering that we might have to endure and our inability to use that life meaningfully, well, then that should be enough to get us back on back on track if we've lost our mindfulness and suddenly we're starting to go down the path of non-virtue or whatever, that we recognize that there are consequences to that. So this was the initial verse that kind of showed that in just a very basic way. Let's go on to look at the next part, which we didn't cover in last week, which is the second outline, and it's called explaining. So we've been seeing this. These are translations that are sometimes different in other texts, but the outline for this started off with showing, and then now we have explaining. So the initial idea was in verse 29. Now we get 3 more outlines within this that explain it further. The first outline is the idea of relying on the outer condition of a virtuous friend. This is one of the other topics that's taught right at the beginning of the Lamrim, the stages of the path, right? We have the reliance upon a virtuous friend, a spiritual guide. This is a very important part of our path. This is how we learn the Dharma. This is how we get introduced to the teachings as well as have support throughout our entire path, is by relying upon a spiritual guide that we have confidence in, that we have faith in. So verse 30 talks about this. It says, through the company of gurus, through the subsequent teachings of abbots, and through fear, mindfulness will easily be generated in fortunate people who act respectfully. Kind of recognizing that if we have these influences on us, the company of gurus, the teachings of abbots, and so on, even our own fear of the consequences of our actions, that we will have mindfulness easily. If we are fortunate people who act respectfully, who act in accord with the teachings. So again, this idea is mentioned in the commentary from Gyaltsab. Let me take this off screen while I go through this. Gyaltsab on page 19 of the commentary says, the fortunate ones respect the training and will follow the advice of their abbot, their preceptor, their friends in pure training, and the like, out of a feeling of shame and consideration. We're going to talk about those in just a moment. These 2 virtuous mental factors that are mentioned there. These are the methods for protecting mindfulness. So we need kind of additional tools in our mind to help us to maintain our awareness of what we're doing, our non-forgetfulness with regard to our path of virtue. Since they generate easily the mindfulness that does not forget the virtuous object, regardless of whether they listen, contemplate, or meditate, they base their practice on mindfulness. So the 3 types of wisdom were mentioned there in that bit of commentary. So whether we are engaged in the wisdom of listening, which is how we initially accumulate awareness about the teachings, you're listening right now, hearing the teachings, seeing the verses from Master Shantideva on the screen, kind of bringing in that information. It's already some level of wisdom, because even at that level, there's some resonance with the teachings that you're hopefully having that generates some awareness of the truth of those teachings. But then we also need the wisdom they have here arising from contemplating. We sometimes call it wisdom from reflection, from thinking. It's where you actually take the teachings and you digest them. Hopefully you're doing that to some degree between these weeks when I teach, is to take the teachings in and kind of review them and bring them into your meditation, even to begin to contemplate them a bit more and see if you can see the truth of them for yourself. Then the third level, which is here meditation, wisdom arising from meditation, it goes beyond what we call meditation. I'm speaking of myself here, but I'm assuming that most of you, if maybe perhaps all of you, that don't have the deep meditative concentration of calm abiding or anything above that. Calm abiding is a state where the mind has developed to the degree where we can focus single-pointedly and remain on an object of virtue for as long as we wish. And so there, when you achieve that, there's a pliancy, a subtle sort of serviceability of the mind, suppleness to the mind, all of this that makes the mind very workable and the body as well, so that you then can meditate for as long as you wish. Well, that's when you're able to actually generate deeper realizations, is when you can stay in a place of meditation for much longer. For most of us, we're lucky if we can stay on an object for more than a minute or 2. And it's great that we can do that at this juncture, but we need to continue to develop the mind in that direction. So these 3 wisdoms, whether we're engaged in any of those at whatever level we are, we need to, as it says here, have the mindfulness that doesn't forget the object, the mindfulness that stays present with what it is that we're investigating, what it is that we're trying to realize. So our practice is based on mindfulness. It's the only way that we're going to change our minds, is being able to stay with the topics that we're meditating on, stay with the practices that we're engaging in, and so on. So let's talk a little bit about these two factors that were mentioned here in the first part of Gyaltsab Je's commentary, where he says we need to kind of follow the advice of our gurus and stay with our friends in virtue out of a feeling of shame and consideration. These are the two words that are sometimes even used, shame and embarrassment. And I can't say that I like either of those words for these mental factors. And let's go through what is said about these mental factors. This is also on the handout, again, the handout document that I provided to everybody way back at the beginning of this course. These are mentioned there in regard to these verses. Regarding shame, which is ngotsa shepa, and embarrassment, dalyopa. This is the translation of these as shame and embarrassment. I actually prefer self-respect and consideration for others. But nonetheless, this is how these two have come to be known in most of the studies of the mental factors. I've mentioned the mental factors before in this course, what's called lorik, which is the study of minds, and like Buddhist awareness of the mind and Buddhist psychology, all of this. There are 51 mental factors that are set out. These two, self-respect and consideration for others, or shame and embarrassment, are in the virtuous category. There are 11 virtuous mental factors. So this is what Jeffrey Hopkins says about them. He says, shame is an avoidance of misconduct due to one's own disapproval, whereas embarrassment, or again, consideration for others, is an avoidance of misconduct due to others' disapproval. So we have this kind of difference in terms of how we are generating something that keeps us from moving towards the side of non-virtue. This is a virtuous mind because it keeps us moving towards virtue. And so we can do that on the basis of either ourselves or others. So in terms of ourselves, each of us has, through our own study and practice, developed a sort of inner compass, an inner guide to how we want to live our lives. And we can see that at any time when we're making a moral decision, an ethical decision, and we're moving in the one particular direction, we can have a factor that might want to correct that on the basis of some sort of internal compass of how we want to live our lives. Again, based on our own faith and confidence in what the Buddha has taught, that we want to be more compassionate, caring, kind, that we don't want to cause suffering to ourselves and others. We have those kinds of thoughts that inform it. Shame is when we actually apply that in terms of one's own thinking, one's own sort of ideal that we want to hold ourselves up to. When we get to the embarrassment or the consideration for others, then the idea is that we extend that circle of concern to think about the effect that our actions might be having on others, not those that would be the direct recipient of that, though that can be a part of it, that we don't want to be harming others by saying negative things to them and so on. But it's the bigger picture of what about those who have instilled these teachings in us, like our gurus, preceptors, and so on, all those beings who play a much more central role in helping us on our path. If they were to witness us at that point engaging in non-virtue, there'd be a sense of embarrassment from our side. We'd be embarrassed to be doing those things that are so contrary to what our gurus have told us to do. We can also think about this in general towards the Dharma. Each of us are Buddhist practitioners, and maybe we are in communities where people know us as Buddhist practitioners. Well, we want to kind of uphold those values everywhere we go then, so that we're not in any way having a negative reflection on the Dharma, on the Sangha, on any of the elements of Buddhist practice. So there's just this difference between whether I'm looking at things from myself, which again is the self-respect or the shame that I have personally in regard to the values I want to hold, or whether I'm thinking about how others who have instilled these values in me might feel or might be damaged by virtue of me going astray and engaging in that negative behavior. So Jeffrey Hopkins does go into this a little bit more with the next few slides. He says, these mental factors both have the function of serving as a basis for restraining our misconduct. In the case of shame, or again self-respect, when one is about to engage in misconduct, one avoids it by thinking, this is not something I should do. This could even be akin to what we call conscience, but again, I was relating conscience a bit more with conscientiousness, which is a more general way that we are guided in our behavior. Shame is a factor that comes into play in the moment when we are confronted with a situation where we are tempted to go astray, and it keeps us on track going in the more virtuous direction because we think this isn't something I should do. These are not the values that I want to uphold. This is not the behavior I want to engage in. Whereas in the case of embarrassment, or again, consideration for others, one avoids misbehavior by thinking, since others will despise me, this is not suitable. So this latter involves concern for the displeasure of a lama, a teacher, or the like, someone who, again, we could think of at that time as, oh, if they were there, if they were here right now witnessing me doing this, how embarrassing it would be for me, how much they might, again, despise is a strong word, but others will look down on you a bit unfavorably and say, well, you're really not doing what you should be doing. You're really not upholding the conduct that I taught you or that I feel is appropriate for you based on your dedication to the Dharma and so on. Shame and embarrassment, he says, serve as a basis for restraining misconduct in the sense that to restrain physical, verbal, and mental misconduct, one must definitely have these two. You know, we have to have some measure of thinking about, wow, you know, I really need to uphold things myself, or I need to do that in relation to others. Those serve as a very key element in terms of how we move forward and don't continue to engage in non-virtue misconduct. For if one does not have either concern from one's own point of view over the fruition of an action or concern for the discomfort of a lama or teacher, there is no way to cease misconduct. So this is why, again, we do see this being mentioned a lot in terms of the fear of the consequences of one's own actions. As I mentioned, that can be a very lower motivation. It's taught at the small scope of the Lam Rim. Our concern for our own future suffering is a motivating factor, us wanting to avoid that, not to, again, become kind of over indulgent in this type of fear and living our lives from that place of fear, but we have to recognize the consequences of our action. I mean, we do that, as I said, with this life very easily. We go, you know, a lot of us are spending a lot of time at home now, and so you might go to the refrigerator door constantly and you open it up and you say, ooh, that looks really good. But, you know, I really shouldn't eat that. I've already had so much today, and this is maybe not really good for my health. So we have kind of a voice that measures things in terms of our own standards that we want to uphold, or our own future suffering we might have to endure on the basis of our actions. So this is one factor, one thing that we can use. Of course, we can also think about others, as was pointed out. Either one of those is a way that we keep from engaging in what is unhealthy, what is not moving towards the ideal results. So that first one, the shame or the self-respect, if we actually think about the consequences of our future, of our actions in the future, that can become a big deterrent for us moving in that direction. But as I said earlier, that doesn't stop you from also having thoughts of compassion for others, to think about, oh, I really don't want to engage in this because I'm going to be harming others, and that's not something I want to do. Or even thinking about the bigger harm that we do to ourselves. Every time we engage in a negative action, it's like we're taking steps backward instead of forward towards enlightenment, towards being able to help others. So there's a lot of different thought processes that can go into it. But these two, self-respect and consideration for others, are the main ways that we stay on track, the main ways that we actually divert ourselves from the path of non-virtue and move towards virtue. So let's go on then to, I think that was it from that. Yeah, let's go on to the next outline, the second outline when explaining, again, there are three of them, how to generate the inner condition of correct mental application. So this is a verse and a half. Let's look at those now. Here, Master Shantideva has this kind of quote, or this thinking, this thought that we're generating. I am always dwelling in the presence of all those Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who are endowed with unimpeded vision in all, meaning that they're able to see everything. They have that omniscient mind that is aware of all. By thinking in this way, I shall likewise obtain possession of shame, respect, and fear. So this is this kind of thought that we can bring to mind, this idea that we are in the presence of these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who can see all phenomena without any obstruction, especially the Buddhas who have that omniscient mind. So we remain clearly in their sight. We are being kind of witnessed by them at every moment of our lives. So if we think in this way, this of course instills some level of that consideration for others, the fact that we need to be attentive to our actions because others are witnesses to that. And so that's what is being in the very last line. It says, I shall likewise obtain possession of shame, respect, and fear. Respect is the same word as this consideration for others, this embarrassment. So we have these three things being mentioned in the last line there. The possession of shame, because once more, that shame or self-respect, we know that we want to uphold what the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, our guides and so on, have been instilling in us, that we want to be maintaining that from our side, but also the respect that we have for others, for the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who are witnesses, who are seeing our every action, who can then, uh, know when we're going astray, and we don't want to be of any um, be in any way put down by them or be shut off from them in terms of the way that they've been able to help us. So we have that healthy respect for them in our lives. And fear. Fear is mentioned as the third factor, which in this case, once more, is the fear of the consequences of our actions, especially the rebirths in the lower realms that might ensue. So again, in Gyaltsab in his commentary on page 20, I'm not going to read the first part of it because I already touched on a lot. He says, considering this, this whole idea that's mentioned in verse 31, which you then generate shame, which takes oneself as the reason, and because one has respect for the teacher and the Dharma, which is kind of that consideration for others, and thirdly, fear of the fruition of one's actions, one should take care and practice mindfulness. So this is just, again, giving us more rationale or reasons, that kind of inform our need to guard our mindfulness. Oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hit that. I was going to go down a slide. So let's look at what's in your handout again, still in that same section on these verses that come from A Precious Garland, the commentary that is the other one that I quote from, this unpublished commentary by Abbot Drukpa Gyaltsen. He says, I should be skilled in protecting mindfulness in whichever of the three, hearing, contemplation, and meditation, remember those three wisdoms I just talked about, I do. And furthermore, thinking in this way, I am always dwelling without obstruction in the presence of all those Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who are endowed with unimpeded vision regarding all objects of knowledge in all places at all times. I shall likewise obtain possession of the shame that takes oneself as the reason, the respect for the teacher and for the Dharma, and the fear of the fruition in unfortunate rebirths. So this is just reiterating this idea that these are the three things that are being taken away from this, is these two virtuous mental factors of shame and respect, or shame and consideration for others. Again, we have different words for those translations. And then the third thing, this factor of fear. I find it kind of interesting, just as a little side note on fear, when that traditional study is done and you have the 51 mental factors, there's nowhere in the list of the 51 that the factor of fear is mentioned. And so I've always had those sorts of questions about where does it fit in there? And it obviously derives from a lot of the same root afflictions that all the other ones, the afflictive states of mind, derive from. This is what I'm talking about fear as being an unhealthy fear. But we do have some levels of fear that are actually healthy. So in some ways, I kind of put, there's a one category of the mental factors, it's called the changeable mental factors, meaning that depending upon what state of mind, you can change it from a positive to a negative. And so, or vice versa, from a negative to a positive. So fear, if we look at it, fear is a very important thing in our Buddhist practice. It's something that actually does cause us to be more dedicated wholeheartedly to our practice of Dharma. The Lamrim is taught with the underwriting current of some level of fear, some level of trepidation about experiencing suffering results if one doesn't continue, if one does continue doing what one's doing, and thereby needing to interrupt that. So as I mentioned earlier, on the very first level, the small level of the Lamrim, the small capable being is what Rinpoche refers to that practitioner as. That's where we generate the fear of our future rebirths, which is what's being talked about in this verse in particular, is the idea that if we do engage in these non-virtuous actions, we're going to end up in an unfortunate state. We'll end up as an animal, preta, hell being. We'll have consequences of those actions that will affect us greatly in terms of our future existence there, as well as what ensues from there. Because if we end up in an unfortunate state, we don't have so much opportunity to rely upon virtue and to engage in virtuous activity. But then there's the fear that exists at the middle scope for the middle capable being. That's the fear of samsara in general and the fear of continuing to go from life to life, because even if we get a good rebirth, even if we have a wonderful continuity of human rebirths with rich opportunities and so on, that in and of itself is still not satisfactory. So there is a level of fear there. And even when we get to the great scope, to the third level, the greatly capable being, there can be fears that are motivating factors there. They say one of the fears is the fear of anyone having to suffer. That we kind of have this fear that even embraces all other beings because we recognize that their suffering, because it is suffering, is a problem, and we don't want them to suffer. Whether they're our dearest, companion, or whether they're someone who is our worst enemy, we just simply have an aversion towards any being suffering, a fear of anyone suffering. But the Bodhisattva also has a healthy fear of samsara that was generated previous to that, but even a fear of nirvana, meaning the peace of nirvana that sometimes the practitioners of the Hinayana, the individual vehicle, get sucked into and want to achieve that state of peace for themselves alone. So we see that there's this healthy fear that we are generating in this life that can actually be really instrumental in our practice of the Dharma. Even just to have a fear of death, that's a healthy fear, so that we then prepare accordingly for death, is set out as one of the main meditation topics that we have to engage in. So there is this difference then between the unhealthy fear that is rooted in some of the other afflictions, that has a mind of aversion or an attachment to needing things to be in the same way that we always wanted them to be. We can see fear running rampant in our world right now because people don't like what comes with this uncertainty, not knowing what's going on, the prospect of losing one's life to this virus and so on. There's a lot of fear that's being generated. And some of it can actually be a healthy fear if we respond accordingly. That's where I'm just trying to get across this point in my own mind, that fear, as I see it, is a very changeable factor in our minds, depending upon what thoughts accompany it. Whether we have thoughts of wanting things not to change and getting really bent out of shape when things are going in the wrong direction, and having the fear, the apprehension of where that might lead to, versus seeing that things they need some healthy level of fear. Because if we don't have a good fear of our consequences of our actions, for example, then we don't have that force that keeps us from going to that in that direction. So this is, again, my own reflections on fear. As I said, it's not taught as a factor within the Buddhist psychology in that course, but it is definitely something that we see on the Buddhist path that is important to pay attention to. In this context, fear has a very positive dimension to it. We have these three sorts of virtues that we generate by thinking about us being in the presence of these omniscient beings who are seeing all of our actions, and we have our own confidence in the Dharma, so we take ourselves as the reason for shame or self-respect. We use others, the teacher, our own teachers, our gurus, and the Dharma as this respect or consideration for others. And then we have some healthy fear, a wholesome fear of where we might end up if we go in the wrong direction. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in this short little book, I've only mentioned it maybe occasionally, it's got commentary on just a number of the verses in Shantideva's text. Of course, Shantideva's text is one of His Holiness's favorite. I'm sure he's taught on every chapter of it at some point in much more detail. But he says here, it is important to be sure of our practice, clearing up all doubts and making certain that we understood everything correctly. This confidence in the practice has to be based on clear reasoning and faith, determination and stability, and respect for the practice we are doing. So his initial thoughts are all about how everything is informed by our own relationship with the Dharma. If we have a correct understanding and have generated some level of confidence, some conviction in the teachings based on our own reasoning, then that will be informing what we're doing. So he says, then our action should be guided by our own conscience, which was the translation term for that shame or self-respect, by concern for what others might think, which again is the consideration for others or the embarrassment, and by dread of the consequences of negative actions, some sort of fear that recognizes that there are results of our negative actions that are not so favorable. So then he says, keeping our senses under control, let us be peaceful and try to make others happy. Not let ourselves, and we're going to see this theme coming up a little bit in terms of how we can fall under the control of our senses. And we need to be kind of aware of that and do what we can to avert that. Because when we do come under the control of our senses, we either get totally enticed by them and develop a strong mind of craving and desire, or we have some revulsion to them and we end up getting a mind of aversion, anger, and so on. So if we keep our senses under control, we try to be peaceful, and we do our best to make others happy, this should be what comes out of those three factors being applied. It's kind of a different way of putting it a little bit, but I think it's totally in line with what Master Shantideva is saying, is that this is what keeps us mindful of what we're doing in practicing the path of virtue, which once more is what we're going to get into in more detail shortly, which are the three levels of morality that are taught as part of the perfection of morality or ethics, this second perfection. So now we move on to the third of these three outlines within this explaining in terms of guarding mindfulness as the method for guarding introspection. Here, this outline is called How to Generate the Inner Conditions of Mindfulness and Introspection. So there's a verse and a half for this, the remainder of verse 32, which says, also through doing this, recollection of the Buddha will repeatedly occur. So we do need to have this kind of awareness, this recollection, remembering the Buddha as well as the Dharma and the Sangha. These, keeping our mind aware of those, having a recollection of those is healthy for us, kind of keeps us aware of the qualities that we want to adopt, the things that we want to avoid, and so on. And then the next verse, when mindfulness abides for the purpose of guarding against afflictions from the doorway of the mind, then introspection will come about, and even that which had gone will return. So this verse is speaking to the fact that when we do have mindfulness that is there, that keeps us, guards us against the afflictions, keeps the doorway of the mind kind of attended to so that we don't allow those things to arise, then the introspection, that guarding alertness, will come about. It will be there as a force that can be utilized to keep us on track, and even that which had gone will return. So let me read a little bit from what Gyaltsab J says. For this, now we are on page 20. There's actually two outlines for this, and I didn't divide the outlines and put them on the slides just because it gets to be too many sub-outlines. But this whole idea of how to generate the inner conditions of mindfulness and introspection, the first one is how to generate mindfulness, which is having this generation of the awareness, the recollection of the Buddha, which keeps us then on track with practicing the Dharma. Gyaltsab J says, a person who thinks in this way will also recollect the qualities of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, as I said, all three jewels. Because this happens repeatedly, they will easily generate mindfulness of the three jewels. Of course, the main jewel we're trying to maintain our awareness of is the Dharma, and the teachings that we want to be practicing. So that at any time, if we have that recollection, that mindfulness, thinking about those, we then stay on track with what it is that we're trying to do. The second outline was verse 33, how to generate introspection from mindfulness. So here Gyaltsab J says, at the time when one, through mindfulness, remains alert to protect oneself from the affliction. So when we have that mindfulness of the Dharma that is in place, that is keeping the afflictions from arising, then introspection, which analyzes which action is suitable and which is unsuitable, comes into existence. So our introspection can act as a tool to help us to know then what direction we want to go in. Whether we want to go in the more virtuous path that is appropriate, that is suitable, and that which is, that we want to avoid, avert, which is what is unsuitable, which goes against the Dharma. So he says that introspection, which analyzes which action is suitable and which is unsuitable, comes into existence, and even our degenerated introspection, or any introspection that we have not been able to maintain a full force of, returns through the force of our mindfulness. So we can see that, again, these two factors work in tandem, and by strengthening our mindfulness, guarding our mindfulness, we then help our introspection, we help our awareness to develop at that time. So the final talk about this is last sentence from Gyaltsab Je says, since the skill and practice depends on mindfulness and introspection, one should become adept in this, these two factors being really central to our entire path. Now, it's interesting, in the other commentary that I've been citing frequently by Abbot Drukpa Gyaltsen, he goes off to talk about how this even applies to our relationship to food, which I was alluding to earlier with the refrigerator and what have you, how we need to make sure that we are eating appropriate food, not overeating, not undereating, so that we don't nourish our body accordingly, so that we have the strength for practice. But being very attentive to that is also one element of our practice, is to make sure that we have a healthy relationship with how we sustain our body, and the thoughts we should be having when we are eating, of wanting to have this body be a suitable basis for us to continue to practice the Dharma. He then goes on to talk about another physical behavior, which is sleep, and reiterates what many of you have heard, I'm sure, in other teachings around not getting too little sleep, but of course not getting too much sleep. I think in the West we tend to perhaps indulge in a bit more sleep, maybe not all of you, but we all do our best to kind of make sure that we're getting the rest that is necessary for our bodies, but not spending too much time in sleep so that we then miss the opportunity to practice. What they traditionally say is you divide the night meaning from when it's dark to when it gets light, into 3 periods. I guess each period would be roughly 3 or more hours, depending upon what time of year it is, how much darkness there is. Maybe in the summer, even a little bit less than that. But you would kind of divide it into 3 parts. And they always say that the middle part is when you should be sleeping. In the early part of the evening, when it's still dark, but before you've gone to bed, you should be practicing. And of course, if you get up quite early, which is what His Holiness does, I think His Holiness goes to bed sometime around 8 or 9 o'clock at night and gets up at around 3 o'clock in the morning. And he does his practice from 3 till 6 or 7 when he has his breakfast. So, I know it's not possible for a lot of us to do that. You might be in home situations where it's very inconvenient to the other people that you live with if you're up to those hours and getting up quite early in the morning. And once more, most of us don't have the ability to sustain our bodies with that little bit of sleep. But try to be attentive to sleep and see, again, to what degree are we falling under the sway of our afflictions, which might be our attachment to sleep, just like our attachment to food and so on, and thereby succumbing to behaviors that are maybe not as beneficial. They say Lama Zopa Rinpoche, doesn't sleep at all. And, certainly it doesn't seem like he sleeps. Whenever I've been on retreats with him, you can, know that he's up at all hours. Sometimes I've been called in to go meet with him or something at different hours that I didn't expect to be called. So, he doesn't really have this strong attachment to sleep at all. They do say that if you generate very deep meditative concentration, you live off of that, and that sustains you in many ways. You don't need as much food, you don't need sleep at all, and perhaps these great beings like Rinpoche have these high realizations and accomplishments that allow them to not need those physical things as much as we do. But each of us has to have some mindfulness around all of that too. So while this chapter, the main emphasis has been on our mindfulness of our behavior and what we're doing and following the path of virtue and not allowing non-virtue to arise, with this focus on the perfection of morality, it also spills over into the other behaviors of our lives, the other physical aspects of our lives, that we should have some awareness about how we are using that time as well. So I just thought I'd mention that. I didn't want to share too much of that text actually, but at least just give you some summary, a recap of what was talked about in Abbot Drukpa Gyaltsen's text on that. So now we are moving into another outline. Remember that the big outline that we were dealing with, explaining extensively how to practice, had 4 outlines. We just concluded the second one. Now we go on to the third one. The third outline covers a whole bunch of verses. This is what we're going to be in for the next few classes, verse 34 through verse 97. And it in particular deals with the three types of morality that are traditionally taught as part of the perfection of morality or ethics. So again, this is the practice of guarding the mind with mindfulness and introspection. All these outline headings start sounding the same. The one said guarding the mind by guarding mindfulness and introspection or something. This is the practice of guarding the mind with mindfulness and introspection, which is once more getting into the three main practices, if you will, or divisions of the perfection of morality. So we're going to see this divided up into three parts then. The first is the training in the morality of restraint, which is the first of the three, and I'm going to talk about that next. I'm going to just briefly introduce the other two because we'll go into them in more detail when we get to the verses that pertain to them. Beginning with verse 59 up through verse 83 is the way of training in the morality of accumulating virtuous dharmas. Whereas the first one is more about restraint, reframing from non-virtue. The second one is about accumulating virtue. And again, those are oftentimes done at the same time. When we avoid non-virtue, we are creating a virtuous mind, but nonetheless, there needs to be some emphasis on how we actually cultivate the virtuous dharmas, the virtuous activities. The third one is the training in the morality that accomplishes the welfare of sentient beings. This is the verses 84 through 97 will talk about the fact that another aspect of morality for the bodhisattva is the desire to benefit others through one's actions, which of course are also virtuous dharmas. It's not to say that they aren't included in the second one, but the emphasis here is more on how do I help those in need? How do I help those who require my attention, my assistance at various times? So this is, again, the traditional three categories or three divisions of our practice of the perfection of morality. So again, you do have on the handout some summary verses for summary commentary from Abbot Dr. Gyaltsen. Let's go into that next in regard to the first one, the ethics of restraint from faulty behavior, which is again what I was calling this. I think on the previous slide it said the morality of restraint, but on the handout that you have, that file, it was called there this restraint from faulty behavior. So the ethics of restraint from faulty behavior, he says, refers to the 10 abandonments in which one abandons the 10 non-virtues when the motivation is taken into account, and which in terms of entity refers to the ethics that abandon the 7 of body and speech. So I may have missed up some punctuation in that, but the idea here is that it pertains primarily to the 10 abandonments. There are 10 non-virtues that are traditionally taught. And when the motivation is taken into account, that includes all 10, because 3 of those 10 are actions that are solely mental, solely of mind. But in terms of entity, if we talk about it really in terms of the ethics that are actually refraining from faulty behavior in a more, I don't know, manifest way, that would be abandoning the 7 of body and speech. That would not include the 3 of mind. So let me go over these very briefly. I didn't put a slide together for this, but most of you are aware of these 10 non-virtues. We again have them divided into body, speech, and mind among the 10. The first 3 are those of body, and they are essentially killing, taking the life of another being intentionally. Secondly, stealing, which means taking something that is not offered that belongs to another being, doesn't belong to you. And thirdly, engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior, which is generally referred to as adultery, where you're having sexual relations outside of a committed relationship. Either that person that you're having relations with is in a committed relationship, or you yourself are in a committed relationship and you are engaging in adulterous behavior then. It can also, though, of course, include any sexual behavior where we are coercing another, doing things that would cause them to have behavior that is not what they wish to do. There are other ways that we engage in things that are maybe not so wise sexually, but those are the main ones that we talk about in terms of this misbehavior. Then you have 4 of speech. The 4 of speech are lying, using dishonest words, representations of words. Again, we have many ways that we can lie to others. We can lie to others through texts and emails, and we can lie even by not revealing something that someone's asked of us, by silence, what have you, by lying by omission, they say. The second one is to engage in divisive speech, speech that causes people to have a furtherance of a division that they have between them, or creates a new division between people that weren't divided. The third one is harsh speech, which is the use of language, words, and so on that are cutting, that are insulting, that are hard for people to hear. And of course, we might do that with a good motivation. That might become very different, but oftentimes we don't have a good motivation behind that. We really want to hurt others with the words that we say. The fourth one is what we often call meaningless talk or idle gossip, the idea being that all the other stuff that we engage in that's not so virtuous, that we spend a lot of time talking about, and when we get really involved in it and spend hours talking about meaningless things with others, it's not such a heavy non-virtue, but it causes us to waste a lot of time, and by virtue of that, it becomes very heavy. Those four of speech, the three of body, those are the seven that constitute the ethics of restraint in terms of the real entity of it. If we sort of look at how that is manifest more, is that we want to refrain from those things that harm others and ourselves, that are actions of body and the actions of speech. And of course, we engage in those generally with others, right? There are others involved. The three of mind are kind of there in terms of the 10 that we want to avoid. But as was said, again, the 7 are the main ones that we're referring to here. The three of mind are kind of heightened forms of the 3 root delusions, the 3 root poisons. The worst of these 3 is said to be wrong view, which is a form of ignorance where we are clinging tightly to incorrect views of things, especially the view that karma doesn't exist. This is why it's best to just kind of work with the teachings on karma as good as you can, but have that sort of willingness to work with them. Venerable Rabina says as like a working hypothesis, as something that you're treating as a way to live your life. Even if you don't have strong conviction that karma is operative, don't go to the place of denying karma, which is what wrong view does. And it can deny also any other things that the Buddha taught as existing that we are denying, and by virtue of that, damaging our own awareness, our own wisdom, but also potentially engaging in misbehavior on the basis of that. The second worst of these 3, though oftentimes it can be the worst in terms of consequences, is malice or ill will that we can have towards somebody, which is where we make the determination in our minds to harm another being. We can do that out of any other sort of motivations, but the main one that's driving it obviously is a mind of anger, a mind of ill will that has generated to that degree. The third, the least powerful of the 3 of those, but it's sort of a force by which we do get into this mind that causes us to want to accumulate and gather things around us out of attachment. The third poison, it's often called covetousness. But when I grew up in the Catholic tradition and they talked about covetousness, it was just having these sorts of thoughts about somebody else's possessions or what have you. And it usually, of course, would lead to one engaging in stealing or doing something. If one was coveting someone else's goods or coveting someone else's partner, then it would lead to adultery. Obviously, those are part of this. But covetousness also just includes the general way in which we want anything that belongs to anyone else, even if they're selling it. So if we go into a store and we start shopping around or go on the internet and start wanting to accumulate all these things, this is a part of the mind of covetousness. It's the mind that is always thinking about how can I get more for myself. And so it's driven by attachment. And of course, it's the mind behind that. And we can engage in other non-virtue when we have that being enacted. If we decide to steal something from somebody, and we visit them at their house and we like something that they have on their mantelpiece and we keep looking at it, and then one day we decide to pocket it because we've got that covetousness that led us to do that. That becomes not just covetousness then, but the act of stealing. So covetousness is something that we do engage in quite a bit in our culture. And of course, we're driven by advertising and so on to want to accumulate more, to want to have all these things. And you can buy things with good motivation. It's not to say that you can't buy anything, but watch the underwriting mind of attachment that's underneath all of that, that leads us down that pathway of accumulating more, of wanting all these things. So anyway, those are the 3 that get excluded when we talk about the entity of this first level of ethics, this first level of morality. But know that they are involved because certainly they are the mindsets that lead us down the pathway of engaging in unhealthy physical and verbal actions. So this is a little passage that I didn't include in, yeah, the other one was from Abbot Darkba Gyaltsen. This was not in your handout. Oh, maybe it is. I can't remember if it's in your handout or not. Maybe it is. But if it isn't, then I apologize. But yeah, there were a few things. I did this last week when I was preparing for this, and I don't remember what I pulled from other sources. There's a wonderful book called The Six Perfections by Geshe Sonam Rinchen. There's a new book on the Six Perfections by Lama Zopa, but I haven't read all of that book yet. This other book I'd read many years ago. He says there, a bodhisattva's ethical discipline of restraint from faulty actions is the intention to stop doing anything which is of harm to others and to dispel the source of that harm. So it's kind of got two ideas to it: to stop doing the actual actions, the physical things which verbal things which are of harm to others, and to dispel the source of that harm, which again are the thoughts we have within our own minds that cause us to go down the path of non-virtue, to have those faulty actions. So harm here refers primarily then to the 7 harmful physical and verbal activities: killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, harsh speech, divisive speech, and meaningless speech. So these are the 7 that are primarily the harming that we're doing to others. But as it says there, also to dispel the source of that harm, which can be the wrong views, the harmful intent, the ill will that we can have, the covetousness that can be behind all of those. These physical and verbal actions are forms of violence and spring from 3 harmful mental states: covetousness, harmful thoughts, and wrong views. So just reiterating what I had just gone through and telling you about those 10. Then this I know wasn't in. I'm pretty sure that this isn't in your handout. I took some from the great treatise, the Lamrim Chenmo of Lama Tsongkhapa. He says the Bodhisattva Levels. This is a text by a sangha, the Bodhisattva Bhumi. Says the ethical discipline of restraint is the 7 types of vows of individual liberation. So these 7 things that those who take ordination have a stronger vow, a pratimoksha vow, to refrain from those. But essentially, the core of some of those are included in even the 5 vows of individual liberation that lay people take. But he says, thus, given that there are those who have taken vows of individual liberation and are also keeping the bodhisattva vows, the ethical discipline of restraint is either the actual vows of individual liberation for the group of either lay persons or renunciants, or it is a practice of restraint and abstention that would be associated with those actual vows. So it's just giving kind of another context for looking at them in terms of how we would relate them to what are called the pratimoksha or individual liberation vows. They are really the fundamental building blocks of Buddhist morality. Remember, His Holiness the Dalai Lama always speaks to the fact that, if we can help others, that's wonderful. But if we can't help them, at least do no harm. At least don't harm beings. This is the real underpinning of all Buddhist morality, this concept of ahimsa, non-harmfulness. So it was just kind of an interesting little point relating it to that. And then Tsongkhapa continues. He says, also, given that there are those who have taken the bodhisattva vows who are unsuited to be recipients of the vows of individual liberation. And here he's probably talking more about the pratimoksha vows that are full ordination, or taking vows to become a monk or a nun. Not all of us are suitable to engage in that type of vow taking. Instead, we might take just the lay vows of individual liberation. So he says, given that there are some who are unsuited, who are still bodhisattvas, the ethical discipline of restraint is the practice of restraint and abstention that gives up any deed that is wrong by nature or any deed that is wrong by prohibition that would be associated with the vows of individual liberation. So again, this is just expanding it to include, even for those who don't take full ordination, who don't become monks or nuns, it includes any of our restraint from the behaviors that would be included had we taken those vows. And there are both those that are natural, wrong by nature, or deeds that are wrong by prohibition that the Buddha himself said that we should not engage in because they go against the rules, the laws that we generally want to abide by in terms of our behavior, but don't have a nature of being wrong. mean, even among the 5 lay vows, most of you know the 5 lay vows, the first 4 are included in things that we want to avoid in terms of avoiding the 10 non-virtues, or the 7 non-virtues that we've been speaking of. The first one is killing, to avoid killing, to avoid stealing, to avoid adultery and, any coercive sexual behavior, which is our sexual misconduct, and then to avoid lying. The 5th one that's added on is one by prohibition. It's one that the Buddha himself said that he didn't want us to engage in, not because it's wrong by nature, but rather that it is dangerous for us because it causes us to potentially engage in non-virtue. And that is to refrain from alcohol and intoxicants. There's nothing sort of innately immoral about drinking or taking drugs or whatever. It's just that by virtue of what the Buddha wants us to practice, he wants to prohibit those because any engagement in those substances could lead us down the path of having further negativities and consequences from that. So again, with that last part from Tsongkhapa, and I had added those last week, I'm not sure that it was so important to add them, but they just give us kind of another way of looking at this idea of restraint. As we can see them related to vows, it's to keep us from moving against the vows themselves if we've taken them, but also the principles of those vows, the ways in which those vows are meant to uphold good behavior by refraining from what is naturally a misdeed, but also even what is prescribed by the Buddha as a misdeed. So it doesn't mean, again, that we all have to avoid alcohol and intoxicants if you haven't taken that vow, but it is good to have some mindful awareness around that and to recognize that these things can become problematic. And even when we look at the monastic vows, like for example, there is one where the monks are encouraged or discouraged from engaging in gardening, things like that, to dig into soil. Well, why is it that they don't want monks or nuns engaged in digging in soil? Because of the harm that can happen to the beings that are living in those places. So even when those of us who aren't ordained are out working in our gardens when, gets warm, we just had snow here today, so it's not quite warm enough to get out and dig in gardens. But anyway, if you get out there and you start digging in the garden, do so with mindfulness, do so with an appreciation for not wanting to harm others, not wanting to go against the spirit of those vows that the Buddha gave to those that are ordained, that we want to kind of abide by the same idea. That's at least how I'm interpreting what Tsongkhapa is saying in that section. So it's about 1:45. Let's just see if there are any questions or comments in regard to what I've been going through so far. Again, if you want to ask a question, you can unmute your mic and do that, or you can put it in the chat box. And it's perfectly fine if you don't have any questions, but I'm always happy to spend time doing that. So. Okay, so no takers on that. Let's go ahead and go back to the text then, because we do have a fair amount to cover, and I'm happy to continue going through the commentary. We'll do that for about 15 minutes then, a little less than that. So that's enough again on the ethics of restraint. Oh, we do have a question, sorry, from the chat box. Let's go stop the share. And one quick one, okay, from Andrea. Did you want to ask it, or are you putting it
I'll
in
ask.
the chat box?
I'll ask.
Okay,
like
wonderful.
I always find fascinating when we get into material that talks about fear and shame, because it always triggers me on the Christian Judea side of religion. So I'd love for you to kind of, because then it comes the guilt and the, and I know in the Buddhism we have the daily purification. So I think it's important to, if you can elaborate a little bit, because I get aversion. I'm like, oh, here you go. It's hard for me to look at it with compassion.
Yes, I know. I mean, that's why I'm sharing those texts that have those words in it, like shame and what have you. Fear even, yes, as you said, that can also be one that brings up a lot of stuff. But, I don't like this word shame for that mental factor, because I think again, shame can often lead to negative feelings towards oneself, feeling like you're worthy of that shame and therefore an awful person, and then you feel the guilt that gets piled on top top of that. And so by all means, we don't want to go to that place. That's not what, if you look at these mental factors in terms of self-compassion, which of course is a big topic in not just Buddhist circles, but in mental health circles, self-compassion being an essential part of how we actually tend to ourselves. We in the West don't have a very good record on self-compassion. We have a lot of self-loathing, self-hatred
Right,
even,
right.
uh, putting ourselves down because we're not living up to those ideas. So the whole point is that we want to embrace these ideas that are being presented in this text of seeing those three factors, having some self-respect, having some consideration for others, even having some healthy fear, a wholesome fear of the consequences of our actions from the point of view of really caring about ourselves, seeing ourselves through the lens of being a suffering being just like everyone else, and how we too don't want to suffer.
Right, but
You
I
know?
think they have a complete different wiring from us, because when we think of fear, we're
Yeah,
worried about going to hell, right? Like,
yeah.
and I think they come from compassion and benefiting others before the fear. I think we operate from different places. I don't know.
Mhm.
Anyway,
But I think that there still can be that same level of compassion that's can be in both cultures. Though obviously, yes, we are a bit more wired to go to the places of the negative thoughts about ourselves on the basis of this, or the fear that becomes, yeah, a bit unhealthy if we don't put it in the right context. That's why, like when I went through that and I was talking about how when we are introduced to fear in the Lam Rim, it's from a place of self-concern. And it's good to already at that point introduce some of that self-compassion and say, okay, I see what it's like even in this human life to deal with suffering, to be ill, to have problems with my body, problems with my mind, and so on. And I don't want to experience that. Well, therefore, the most compassionate thing I can do for myself is to refrain from creating the causes for that.
right,
And so fear in that context can still be turned around and not made so much into, I'm going to be like living with all this, huge weight over me and this heaviness of the consequences of my actions, and not really kind of embracing it with positive thoughts. We can
right,
change that into the positive thought of, I care about myself and my future suffering. And so therefore, I don't want to engage in anything that would exacerbate that. I mean, if I look at I share this story frequently, and you may have heard it before. When I was studying over in Italy for 7 years, about halfway through my time there, I came back to the States and I had all my blood work done. And I actually was in Indianapolis visiting my mom. My father had died in 2000. This was around 2001, 2002. I went to see my father's doctor, and he did all of my blood work. And then he called me because I'd gone back to New Mexico at that point for the rest of the summer. And he called me and he goes, based on your blood work and what's going on, you're going to have to change things or you're going to end up just like your father. My father had diabetes and heart
oh
disease and
shame,
all these things that caused his death eventually. So I took the doctor's advice very seriously, and he said, I needed to change my diet, which of course he told me to get on a Mediterranean diet, which is so funny because I was living in Italy
in
about 10
Italy.
miles from the Mediterranean Sea, but we weren't on a Mediterranean diet. The diet at the Institute was very heavy on a lot of starchy stuff. You'd come down and there'd be white rice and white pasta and potatoes and very little vegetables and not a whole lot of diversity beyond that. And so I stopped eating at the Institute. I had to make all of my own food. I went out and I exercised a lot more because I wasn't really doing that much exercise. And there were consequences to it. I spent a lot more time doing all of that than I did studying then, because I had to, engage in more activities for my health. But I tried to do it with a very compassionate motivation, thinking about my future suffering. And there's no guilt involved in that, right? I don't sit there and beat myself up that I didn't eat better, that I didn't exercise more.
Right,
You just do what needs to be done. And so I don't think
right,
we feel that guilty when we move in that direction based on other information. But somehow when we get the Buddhist teachings and they're about our morality and our behavior, that somehow we start overlaying all of that because we've heard it from other traditions. Because
right.
in Catholicism, you hear that if you're a bad person, you're going to end up having an
How?
eternity in hell and all this. And so we translate it differently. When we hear stuff that's
Right,
good advice for us to follow in terms of our diet, then we can hear it. But in terms of our behavior, we start overlaying stuff. Again, you can do both of those things, whether it be correcting your diet or correcting your behavior from the point of view of self-compassion, from the
Right.
point of view of I want to be able to be free of more problems, more difficulties in my future, so I can be on the path more. I can dedicate my life to others, whatever the
Right.
case might
Right.
be. And of course, that's the first level of motivation, is self-concern. And then it becomes more about concern
Right.
for
Right.
others when we get to this path. Because if I really see that every day that I shave off of my life by not being healthy, then there's a motivation to be healthy, to help others.
Right. Right. Right.
It's
Right.
the
Right.
same with regard to my morality. If I end up in another rebirth where I can't help others because I'm stuck in an animal body that isn't conducive to me helping others,
Right.
then I'm also being, detrimental to the benefit of other beings. So
Right.
as much as possible, we have to change that thinking.
Change.
And again, it's just a habit. You weren't born with those thoughts that
No.
that if you were immoral and went down the wrong pathway that you were going to burn in hell. That was a thought someone gave to you, that they put
Right.
in your
Right.
head. If we change the thoughts ourselves, which we do over time, then we can do things from a different point of view and be equally successful in refraining from negativities. So,
Makes sense. Thank you.
okay. You're
Good
welcome,
to see
Andrea. Good
you.
to see your face. Yeah. I really appreciate everyone these questions and taking the time to ask them, because I think it is important that we make sure our practice is as positive as possible. This is a path of joy, a path of enthusiasm for what we're doing, and not a path of weighing ourselves down with all kinds of burdens. I know even when people look at vows, they start thinking, oh my God, I've got to live with all these oppressive vows on me. But vows are actually a gift, because they tell us exactly what the pathway is. So we get it delineated very clearly. And when we know then when we're going to be astray. So it's a wonderful gift to have the vows. But please do, if you are thinking about engaging in the Bodhisattva vows or even the Pratimoksha vows, study them, spend some time working with them so that you're aware of them. And when you eventually do take them, then you have the ability to uphold them. Because as we see, Bodhisattva vows are definitely a part of the 6 perfections that we're studying in the rest of this text. And they're essentially a part of our practice of morality. To refrain as this first category, to refrain from non-virtue, means to also refrain from breaking your vows. Any other comments? We only have about 5 minutes left. Let me just go back to the text then and just introduce where we're going to go from here, because I don't think we have much time. But this first one, training in the morality of restraint, we're going to see that this has 2 major outlines. And the first one is going to be how we purify the actions of the 3 doors. And the second one that is going to follow from that is how we protect the 3 doors from degenerating. So the 3 doors that we're going to be referring to, and there aren't actually 3 parts to this, even though it says there's 3 outlines coming up to this first one. They aren't actually the 3 doors that we spoke of earlier. Remember how when we divided up the 3 non-virtues, we talked about them being of body, speech, and mind. These are what are traditionally called the 3 doors or doorways. And the idea is that this is how we engage in non-virtue, this is how we engage in virtue. All of our actions, of course, begin with the mind. This is central to the whole concept of karma, is that everything is an energy we generate within our own minds that can be directed in a positive direction, a neutral direction, or a negative direction. And our minds, though, it doesn't just stop with our minds. It frequently comes out then in terms of what we say, our verbal actions, as well as our physical actions. So those are the 3 doorways or channels by which we engage in virtue or non-virtue, or we can even, again, include neutrality. The Buddha didn't say a whole lot about neutral actions, but we do a lot of neutral actions throughout our day. Sometimes there might be, moments where we're just doing something by rote and not really out of any sort of strong intention, positively or negatively. But the ones we want to really pay attention to are the non-virtues that we want to avoid, which is what this main category of these 3 types of morality is about, as well as the virtues that we want to engage in, which is what the second category, which we're going to be looking at next week, hopefully as well. So just know that we're getting into a bit more of the meat of this chapter in terms of how we are using mindfulness and introspection with regard to practicing those 3 types of morality: refraining from what is negative, cultivating what is virtuous, and then benefiting other beings, doing what we can to make sure that we are in the best position to help others, to assist them in their moments of suffering. which I'm sure many of you are doing. And I really, think that it's important at this time, if we can, to do something that's on the ground, helping others to the degree that we can. But if we can't do that, then at least to find ways to help those that are in those situations through donating, through whatever way that we can. Certainly even staying at home. I've been pointing this out in some of these classes now because many people are in stay-at-home order places. It's important that we look at that as an act of compassion towards others. It is really important that we see it in that lens, to say that by my sacrificing some of my freedom to go around and do what I want to do and limiting myself to being at home, it's not a selfish act at all. It's an act of compassion towards others. It keeps others from having to deal with more sick people in this world right now and be overburdened with all of that. And even by our being around and potentially infecting others and so on. So all of our behavior, again, can be influenced in those directions of making sure that we're attentive to how to move in a more virtuous direction and avoid what is non-virtuous. So I hope tonight was useful and giving a little bit of a flavor of what we're going to be working with for a good number of the next few weeks. Let's go ahead and do the dedication prayers. Let me skip over the Heart Sutra and go to the general dedication prayers. So we have this first one that is essentially dedicating all the positive potential that we've created here tonight through turning our minds towards the Dharma, all the thoughts we've had, the words we've said, the words we've heard, everything, all of this, may it bring forth the results of our own enlightenment and thus the enlightenment of all beings. So let's recite this verse with those thoughts in mind. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Then this next verse is all about this mind of bodhicitta that we hopefully have come to treasure ourselves already, and we see how precious and supreme this mind is, and we make this strong determination that this mind will continue to develop and grow in our own hearts and not diminish in the least. But we also want to carry forward that aspiration that bodhicitta grow and develop in the hearts of all beings, especially the leaders of our countries during this challenging time. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then we make prayers for our spiritual teachers, recognizing, as we saw tonight, that we are influenced by these guides, that they are a source of helping us to know the teachings, to know the Dharma, and also a measure by which we can always be looking to maintain our path of morality and so on, because we see that they are witnesses to our actions, and they've given us this amazing advice out of their compassion and how we want to continue to follow it, and we want to have them continue to be in our lives and in the lives of all beings. So let's make strong dedications for the good health and long lives of all spiritual guides by reciting these prayers for these two. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then for Lama Zopa, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And lastly, let's dedicate for anyone that we're holding in our hearts right now. Again, many of you have experienced loss of friends, acquaintances, and maybe perhaps even family members from this virus or from other causes. You can bring to mind those who have died and dedicate strongly for them that they may have a good rebirth. You can also dedicate for anyone you know who is ill at this time, or even those whose situations you've heard of, those beings who are succumbing to this virus and dealing with other forms of illness in this world, but especially those that you have a personal connection with. Bring them to mind and think that they are freed of all of their suffering and illness by virtue of what we've done here tonight, and obtain perfect health. And then we can also think about those who we know who are experiencing obstacles, whatever those obstacles might be. Again, holding them in your heart, make that strong wish that what we've done here tonight become the cause for removing their obstacles, helping them to have both temporal happiness and eventually ultimate happiness. And may all these beings and every being in this world obtain true peace and happiness through our efforts here tonight. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I enjoyed tonight's class a lot, and I'll look forward to next Monday. And again, next Monday, we'll have some decision about what we're doing on the following Monday, which I'd be happy to do. And my thought was to continue into May. Again, I was supposed to be traveling every Monday in May, most of the Mondays in May, so I really wasn't planning on doing as many teachings, but I was going to do a few from California when I was already there. But I can do teachings, I think, almost on every Monday. So we'll figure that out. And the course will go as long as we need to finish the text. So anyway, thank you all so much. Please stay safe, stay healthy.
Thanks, John.
Okay, you're
Bye.
very welcome. Good. Okay,
Thank you,
bye-bye.
John.